Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Double Exposure Investigative Film Festival. This is the post-screening discussion of the film, The Art of Political Murder. I'm here with the filmmaker, Paul Teller, who directed the film, and with author Francisco Goldman, who wrote the book on which the film is based. I am Daniel Wilkinson. I work at Human Rights Watch. I covered Guatemala for many years. I've lived and worked there. I know a thing or two about the country. I'm a huge fan of Frank's phenomenal book. And now I'm a big fan of Paul Teller's film. So first I want to congratulate Paul on this tremendous work. I think it's a very important film. I think it's important in the same way that Frank's book was so important. Both the film and the book are very much extensions of the work of Bishop Harari himself, right? The work that cost him his life. That work of establishing the truth, documenting the violence, exposing the lies, and doing all that with the hope, with the conviction that telling these stories, telling this truth, can help make sure that it doesn't happen again. Right, and so I think this film is a very important contribution. So again, congratulations, Paul. And maybe just to start off the discussion, Paul, you could tell us a little bit about how you came to do this, why you wanted to do this film, and in retrospect, when you signed up to do something in Guatemala, did you realize what you were getting yourself into?
Thank you very much. I mean, that was a very kind introduction. So I was first approached by Rise Films, who's a production company that were produced the film, and they had optioned Frank's book. And Teddy, the producer at Rise, said that I should read it, and that he would like to make a feature version of it, a documentary based on Frank's book and with Frank. And so I read the book, and I mean, it was only a few pages into the book that I was immediately taken by it. I was really interested in being involved in the project. It didn't take much at all, because I mean, as you know, Frank's book is a masterpiece of nonfiction storytelling, and it was really intriguing. And so then me and Frank spoke on the phone, and we talked about how we could approach it as a film. But then there was, obviously there was a lot of questions immediately from the get-go, because it's such a thorough account of the case and the investigation that happened after Harari's murder. And so to then think about how can we transpose this into a 90-minute documentary, and in a way that kind of maintains the essence of what Frank had achieved with the book, but also with so many details and so much fantastic accounting that he had done in his book, it immediately posed some questions. How are we going to convert this into a 90-minute film that people can understand and have an emotional connection to? And so we began those discussions quite early on. And in terms of, I mean, the second part of your question, Guatemala, I'd never been to Guatemala before. The only contact I'd had is through Frank's book and through reading about his experience going back to Guatemala and in the writing of the book. And so it was an adventure.
Well, you got the so many the people you interviewed, great interviews. I know a lot of those people, but you captured them so well. I mean, they're such great storytellers. They have such a great story to tell, but they also tell it so well. So it almost makes it sound easy, but I know, coming in from outside to do research in Guatemala, inevitably there are all sorts of challenges. And I'm just wondering, for you, were there things in terms of the footage you wanted to get, interviews you wanted to do that ended up being difficult just because of the reality of what's going on in that country?
Yeah, I mean, well, we were extremely fortunate because obviously Frank had done a lot of the work for us. 9 years Frank had spent researching and in meticulous detail and kind of connecting the dots between things, and the sort of stuff that have taken us years to do on our own. And so we had a huge head start And also, obviously, there was an enormous amount of trust that people had for Frank because they knew him as a friend and had read his book, and it got us a long way, obviously. And so we were able to fast track past that. And the other part of what you're saying is that obviously it's, I mean, everyone was fantastic interviews. It was, we almost had too much good material. That was the main difficulty we had. Really, most of our effort was in the editing room, was trying to figure out how to structure the story and how to make that work in the form of a 90-minute film.
I would imagine that would have been a huge challenge, because that book has so many narrative threads woven together. It's just so much there, and it's such a complicated case. And when I knew this was turned into a 90-minute film, I just couldn't imagine how in the world do you do that. And I'm curious on that front. I mean, I know, I guess generally, filmmaking, as a medium, this is one of the big challenges. I think you pulled it off very well, but obviously you had to leave out important things. Were there anything in particular that was difficult to part with when you were doing your final editing?
Yeah, there was a lot. I mean, quite early on, we had to accept that we were never going to be able to go into the same sort of detail that Frank did, and for people to have the same sort of accumulation, for it to have a cumulative effect in the way that Frank's book does. And so we had to accept that wasn't going to be possible. And then there were other challenges, like, for example, there's no one main character really you can hang your hat on. I mean, Ranulph is the closest thing we have to an emotional center in the film. Ranulph knew Herardi, is probably our closest connection point to Herardi himself, and had this incredible kind of emotional retelling of some of these events. And so he becomes the closest thing we have to a main character. But then obviously there's this kind of, when he goes into exile for understandable reasons, we lose him in the story somewhat. And so there's a transference that happens really to Leopoldo Zasek, the main prosecutor in the public ministry. And so figuring out some of those structural, how it was going to shape its way through the film was really hard, because there was a lot of people. So what we had to do really was we had to come up with some guiding principles. And one of the main things that was really important to us was to really convey a sense of the danger that people were in, and what that said about the impunity that existed in Guatemala, and the risks people were taking just being involved in this case. And so we want to make sure that the audience came away with a clear understanding of that. The other thing, I mean, the main real structural device through the film really actually was about Ruben Shanax, the witness. And we wanted to make sure that the audience kind of experienced him in the same way that investigators did, which is like this gradually coming to the fore and gradually realizing his importance. And so he was just a witness to start off with, and people didn't really understand his importance and significance until Leopoldo Zasek came on board. And then we structured the film so it was the way he was telling his stories in dribs and drabs was reflected in the structure of the film. And so you're coming to understand how the reason that he was so cautiously telling his story like this was because he was so scared, and that says volumes about the level of danger and the impunity and the danger he was in. And so using that as the main kind of structural device of the film felt very appropriate. And then there was a lot that we kind of cut, and a lot of ideas I had going into it, having read Frank's book, because it's so brilliantly written and has all these vivid imagery, and everyone plays such an integral role. And so I had all these ideas for sequences and everything. And quite quickly, when we got into the edit room, we just realized that there just wasn't the time. And so we had to eliminate a lot and invest more in the emotional connection and trying to help people have an understanding of who Herardi was, why people were so connected to him emotionally, and the real significance of the case. It's just incomparable to Frank's book, obviously, because Frank is able to take us on all these brilliant kind of subplots, and you only truly understand the scope of it through the book, I'm sure.
So Frank, you wrote the book, and you saw the film finally in the final version, just like 2 days ago.
Yes, 2 days ago. I'd seen
did
an
you think?
earlier
Yeah.
rough cut. I forget how long ago, right? Maybe a year ago. And
Mhm.
it was a rough cut. I didn't even have music yet, or I thought I was under the impression it was going to have a narrator. It was really different. So this was an incredible surprise to me, and a lot of things were changed. A lot of things were different. And I have to say, I was just really impressed. I really thought it was powerful. I thought the choices Paul made were brilliant. It seemed, rather than to try to get into all the nitty gritty and entanglements and of what was an incredibly complicated case, he had, in his own way, the same epiphany that I did when I was telling it, but I had to do it in a different way, which was that it was a human story. A criminal case, people think criminal cases, sometimes it's just all about the evidence and very legalistic things. But what I realized really on with this case is all criminal cases and all crimes are committed by people. What makes cases interesting are the people involved in them. And what makes that, and so in the case of what fascinated me from the start when I started to investigate this was not just the case itself, but the people who were doing the investigating. Why were they the people to be doing this? Were they doing things that nobody else could have done? How is this whole case an expression of personalities, really, on both sides, right? On the so-called bad guy side, and on the investigator side, and I don't think I've ever encountered a more complex, at times ambiguous literary character, in real life, in my life, than Ruben Shanax, and so I thought it was just completely brilliant how he caught that essence in the film by making really just smart choices, right? To focus on who these people were and just let you see who they were and let you share their passion for the case and tell some of their story. We all saw it this weekend, by the way. They sent out a tag to most of the people who'd been involved in the case. And I was a bit nervous. What would they think, right? Because everybody who took part in that case probably has their own movie in their own mind of what happened and of their own role in it. And people were just so grateful and happy and felt so rewarded to see, that the story being told the way it was.
Well, that is a very good sign. I think, Frank, at one point many years ago, you told me that people generally don't like what you write about them, and not you in particular, in general, because everyone has their own story. So if you're able to convey it, and all these distinct personalities were happy and moved. I was in touch with a few as well, who were really moved, and they know the story inside out. But you actually saw that in the interviews. That's why I think the interviewing was done very well. You really drew people out. I want to get back to Chinox. Just such a fascinating figure, and to have someone who's so unassuming, so reticent, be so central pivotal character in the narrative is so interesting. I'm curious, maybe, for both of you, what your experience was, what your own interactions with him were like, to draw him out, in the interview for the film. And, I guess Frank also, when you originally were reporting on this.
Well, I first became aware of Shanax, as I say, for me, putting this book together was really following, in a sense, 4 central lines of investigation, right? Through those 9 years, and some other tangential ones, but the one carried out by the church, the Oda, right? The one that we see carried out by Zasig. One that's very important, that's behind the scenes, is the one carried out by the United Nations peacekeepers, MINUBA, right? Where they had a highly professional Spanish government investigator assigned to MINUBA, who was the person who did a lot of the best investigation of the crime scene the night that it happened. From that first, he was like the living encyclopedia on what had gone down in that parish house, as far as could be known, right? The evidence that was there. And he was the one who had early, intense relationship with Shanax. Had sat down with him, had given Shanax a rifle, a military rifle, to see if Shanax could take it apart and put it back together again, to confirm that he really had been a soldier, as he told Guillamon, Rafael Guillamon, the Spaniard that night. Guillamon then fades into the back. Shanax goes into protective custody, right? And I can tell you that Oda never really believed in Shanax. And they did so many great, fantastic things, but he wasn't their witness, right? Their witness was incredibly crucial to the case. Their witness is Otto Checks, the taxi driver, for example, to name Aguilar Martinez. These were just major, major building blocks of the case, right? And just the way Zeysig brought in some extraordinarily important witnesses like Gomez Limon and of course Shanax. And it was really Guillamon who'd been waiting for a prosecutor he could trust, right? Who goes to Zeysig when Zeysig finally inherits the case and goes, this vagrant, Ruben Shanax, he's really interesting. He's been sitting there for 8 years or something, though for 4 years at that point, and nobody's been forgotten about. Go talk to him, right? And I think it's one of the most dramatic sequences in the book when they bring Shanax in out of the cold, right? And it's pages and pages, and how it slowly dawns on Zeysig that Shanax knows much more than he's telling, right? And finally, later on in the book, I had my own very intense involvements with Shanax, because Guillamon, because this is much later in the case, Leopoldo Zeysig has already fled into exile after the convictions, and Guillamon was obsessed with this case, and he was still trying to figure certain things out about who was the shirtless man. And he had a list of questions for me to ask Shanax. And we had to find, it was very secretive where he was, but we know now that in the book it reveals it was somewhere in Mexico City. And so I holed up with him a couple of times in this windowless little room and had intense, long conversations with him. Were just such incredible sort of psychological jousting. I had to, be so alert to figure out what he was telling me that was true, what he was telling me that was baloney, right? I was very intensely aware of his sort of desire to form a friendship because he was lonely, which he really touched me. I think that the key to Shanax always has been, and it explains almost he's incredibly intelligent, incredibly observant. He was obviously dealt a very bad hand in life in so many ways, but he's a survivor. He's wily, he's so skillful. And he knew things, but he always had to be very careful what he told, because this is the key thing. Guatemala did not have witness protection. So at any moment, if he confessed, if in his telling of the story, he crossed a line and portrayed his own complicity, he could be arrested on the spot, especially when he decides to go to trial, right? And the defense people can hear him. That was so incredibly brave. But he had honed his story in a way to always be able to tell what he had seen and what had happened and protect his own position as much as he needed to, right? And so there's a lot of questions, a lot of mysteries, without a doubt, he was there at the garage. Without a doubt, everything he tells about Lima and Villanueva arriving at the garage, and they have the job to sort of, plant false evidence in the crime scene and make the crime scene look a certain way and carry in the chunk. Without a doubt, he was there and he saw that. But did he see more? Did he actually see the murder? Obviously, he can't say that. We don't know if he did or didn't, right? He always knew where to draw the line. He knew a lot about Orantes and Orantes' movements in the house that night. He told what he could get away with telling without getting himself in trouble, right? So it was just very, very tricky for him. If there'd been a witness protection program, it would have been different, but there wasn't.
There's one thing I think the film also does well is you get both in his narrative, but then people describing it, how he slowly, how he reveals more. And the courtroom scene was the two. I mean, the interaction with Byron Lima, which I felt like I knew the character from Frank's book, but to see that was really striking. And then at trial to surprise everyone and tell them even more.
That came out of left field. Nobody was expecting it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Nobody in Oda knew it was going to happen.
But here was something new to me. For me, I mean, that was all that. So it was so powerful. It was so fascinating the way you laid it out, Paul. But then when he started tearing up at the end, that honestly, that I didn't expect, talking about like why he did it, right? You know, it's just from one character, I was expecting that maybe from some of the others, but I wasn't expecting that from him. It was surprising and very moving.
Yeah, I mean, it was striking how his emotional connection to Harari in a way, and then and the insight that gives into why he did what he did in terms of coming clean and telling the full truth at the trial and his motivations for that. It's interesting because sometimes I think of the film as like four different people's relationships to the truth and what it means to them. And so obviously Harari had this very strong relationship to the truth in terms of what he wanted to achieve through the Remy report. And he felt like the truth is going to set people free and contribute towards the healing that needed to happen in Guatemala. And Ranalph went after Harari was murdered, had a very strong relationship towards wanting to uncover the truth for Harari, for his mentor, and also because he was very aware of the forces that were operating against him in Guatemala. And then Zasig himself had a different relationship with the truth, it felt like, in terms of he didn't have the same kind of skin in the game or the same personal connection to Harari. He was someone that just had this extremely strong sense of right or wrong, it feels like, and this internal moral compass. And he wanted to be able to look his children in the eye and say he did the right thing and he did what was right. And then coming to the Chinaks as well, it feels like he had his own journey with the truth, and you see that, for me, you see that in the trial and everything, and step by step as he's going. And he didn't need to add in more information in court. I mean, he would have, everything he had said up until that point was on the record. He didn't even need to come back to Guatemala to go to court. But he made that decision, and he went that extra mile, and he fully opened up about his involvement. And I feel, when I watch all that footage, I feel like I can see that burden being lifted from him. And in his interview as well, and as he talks about why he did it for Harari, because Harari was nice to him and didn't really deserve that. And for me, it always felt like there was a connection in a way between what Chinaks goes through in terms of the unburdening of his own guilt in the court case, and what Harari was trying to achieve through the Remy report for the country in Guatemala. There's a subterranean link between those things that happened, I think. And so, yeah, so we even saw, I mean, I saw it in the footage, but then I saw it in the interview when we did the interview with Chinaks, is that you could tell that there was real emotion there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, that last point is I think a key, that I took away from the film, of the impact of the case and Harari himself, right? Mm-hmm. You think of the report. There's so much in there, and your film conveys it very well, in a tight space, why that report was so important, right? Hundreds of testimonies, all these atrocities documented, but if you think about all of it, 4 volumes.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, what was the most important part of it were the 2 words in the title, never again. Mm-hmm. Right? And if the report was all like facts, this is the truth, it's documenting, that never again is an affirmation. Mm-hmm. It's a conviction, it's a commitment. And it's an affirmation, not just like that there wouldn't be killings, but that this sort of evil, these atrocities can't be completely covered up, and people completely get away with it, right? And that was Harari's affirmation. The killers responded was wrong and killed him. And then the challenge for the team was to salvage that affirmation. But you see that it's almost biblical, right? The Harari's transformative, the way he transformed people was really in death. And I think the Chinooks one of them all, you have his team that really had to step up. They were already true believers, but they stepped up with enormous courage. And then Sasek, who's he's just a prosecutor, and he became a hero, right? But Chinooks is he's from that kind of dark, amoral world, it seems. He's moved to also, and in a way, it's very fitting for someone like Harari with his theology, his devotion to the poor and to have at that level, like that's where the transformation has to take place. Anyways, I felt that was very strong in the film. Now the big question is, never again. Like this documents the success and of uncovering what happened, these killers to justice. But as you make clear at the end of the film, the people, this crime was as established in the court, and as the journalist Claudia Mendez, who also played a very important role documenting this stuff at the time, as she says, this was a state crime. And then what's left is they succeeded so far, but what about who in the state was responsible for it, right? Who might have ordered it? And so the question is, at the end of the day, is this never again? Did they achieve that, or to what extent they fall short? You have thoughts about that, or Frank?
I'll throw this to you, Frank, because you
and Daniel, quite a bit about this too, right? It's like the Harari case is almost a kind of lone star in the firmament of the long struggle for justice, not just Guatemala, but in some ways even Latin America. There's never really been a case or a conviction like this. Out of the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who were murdered by extrajudicial execution, state murders, this is the first time military officers had ever been found guilty. It was huge, right? And all sorts of things had to come together perfectly for this to happen, right? This had never happened before. Like when Paul says, I think Sasek, was somebody who wanted to do the right thing, right? He comes after a long string of people who didn't have that kind of courage. The normal thing in Guatemala is to not do the right thing, is to say, I'm gonna get killed if I do the right thing. Or, I'll make more money if I do the wrong thing. It was so extraordinary for somebody like him to step up at that moment. The same thing with the people in the ODA, the incredible story about the ODAs. The ODA, the way this crime was set up, it should have worked. The army is expert in pulling off these kinds of theatrical murders. There's a long history of them, Daniel, you know them well in Guatemala, where sure, the human rights community would never have been deceived. They would have known that the army had done this murder to send them a message. That message saying, never again, really? Oh, there'll be an again, right? And yet constructed the crime in such a way as to be able to get away with it in court, be able to pin it on a scapegoat, like their plan to solely pin it on Father Mario Orantes, right? In a way, and have him completely blackmailed so that horrible things about him would come out if you ever were to fight against that, right? Entangle the church, smear the church. You think Fox News is a devastating misinformation machine. You should see how most of the Guatemalan media works. It's so controlled and in sync with the right-wing forces and with the army. So this was all set up, right, to go through easily and for them to get away with it forever and to set the messages they wanted to send. And the people those messages were intended for would have understood. And it was only through the absurd courage of these young people at the ODA right? These people, who, except for Fernando, had no police investigative experience. They'd only investigated human rights crimes. A young lawyer like Mario Domingo, who was just phenomenal and was one of my main sources, you know, that's main partners in following this crime in the early stages, especially in later. When they originally thought that, originally they conceived their job as simply to try to block the dog bite scenario, right? They never expected to find themselves, that's why the investigative group, ironically, with a sense of humor, they call themselves the Untouchables, Los Intocables, because they were half playing at being police investigators, but it was deadly serious, right? And they were amateurs. And yet they're the ones who bring in they make the first big breaks in the case, especially finding the taxi driver, right? It's, and it was just an extraordinary, the times are part of it, the sense of historical importance, the way Harari motivated people. But if there's ever been a case that it convinces you that history really does get made by extraordinary people working together, this was it, right? If they weren't there and there'd been people just simply not as talented as them and not as brave as them, without the same camaraderie they had, trying to do the same thing, they wouldn't have succeeded, right? That's what makes it such an extraordinary story. That's what made it something that's why it became something I couldn't let go of for 9 years, right? Obviously, it's not the only thing I did in all those years. I wrote a novel and everything, but I just constantly felt that I was so in debt to them for letting me kind of be a part of what they were doing, speak close to them, be there for some key moments, get to know them. And they had such a struggle. Their lives were so in danger. They were subjected to just the most horrible defamation and smear campaigns. And at the end, I just knew, I've got to tell their story. It's I've never felt just such a sense of obligation, but it was an honor to tell that story. And I knew I had to. It's
yeah, there's so much. I mean, such a phenomenal story, and this film is in a way a good teaser for that. If you enjoyed the film, you got to read the book. It's one of the things that you feel like there could be spin-offs. It's like Breaking Bad, but then there's so many characters here. You have the Chinox one. You could have a whole one about Baloo the dog. I mean,
you could. I've been really addicted to this recent series, the South Korean police procedural Stranger, which is just fantastic. It just struck me, to solve one crime, 16 episodes, right? To solve one crime. And I thought it reminds me of the Harari case so often. You could have done a whole episode on, hour-long episode on the search for the taxi driver, a whole hour-long episode on the dog thing, a whole hour, a whole episode on auto checks and so forth and so forth. And so often when I was the meticulousness, the patience, the constant anxiety that you're chasing a wrong lead, as you often did, right? That trying to keep, sometimes it's so tempting, like little bits of evidence emerge that could possibly be connected, and you have to resist, the temptation to cherry pick always, because it's so tempting to cherry pick. That's exactly how you end up creating false scenarios, right? Sometimes, you victimize yourself. It's just incredibly complex, right? It was just amazing.
So, Paul, I think you have your next project for you. In a few years. You had the opening, that the I don't know what the term for it is, but where you have the title, and and it felt just like it could be for Narcos or any one of those. But the other thing, there's so much more in the story. But what you managed to do during the 90 minutes, I think with a great deal of efficiency, was impressive, and some of these aspects that Frank was just describing that were key for understanding the whole drama. One is the camaraderie, the fact that this was a team effort, right? And it got that balance. You got the sense of like all these people working together, which was absolutely crucial. And the other is the element of fear, right? Which is which is obviously an issue, but like, how do you, any of us writing about or documenting this reality is how do you convey the fear to the audience in a way that isn't just an abstraction, but they feel it a bit, and in a little space it's hard to do. I thought you did that well, having Ronald Ocheta with his story, but there was also one little thing with the where there was the bomb that went off. There was of a hard shift, where I think who was it?
Yasmin Barrios, the judge.
Yeah, no, it was before, but it was the bomb with her. But I'm just thinking of the discussion right before it was Zeisig and Arturo, I think, talking about how difficult and the power, and suddenly it goes dark and boom. It was suddenly viscerally real, and then the situation with the judge, and then that phenomenal thing, and this is a key part of the story, is it's not just these young activists, idealists, or Zeisig, or this guy, on the Chinooks. For any of this to succeed, you need actual people in the state. You need a judge in a traditionally corrupt, pretty decrepit, justice system. Just, the ordinary heroes to step up there. There was no reason she had to do that. So that was another very powerful thing. And then you have the journalist who herself took, showed in tremendous courage, Claudia, her herself seeing her be moved by the judge actually just doing her job. It was
and she was not the only one. The judge who sends out the arrest orders, that was so incredibly courageous. Flor de Maria Garcia Villatoro. She was a real heroine of Claudia's. I mean, the role of these female judges and Claudia in this story is just extraordinary. Because they were expected. When that bomb went up, they had already chased. The trial had already been postponed numerous times because they'd managed to frighten judges into exile and intimidated judges into recusing themselves. They never expected Yasmin Barrios to come back to court that day. It was just monumentally courageous. And this is, of course, the judge who later on presides over the trial, the genocide trial of General Efrain Rios Montt, right? We just talk about a Guatemalan hero. It's so yes, right. And one thing I just wanted to go back to really quickly, because you asked me about the intellectual authors, right? The book does begin to narrow in on some of that. Shanak's testimony, right? As it was a decision made, I understand, to not point to storylines that went beyond the outline of the story Paul was telling. But Shanak's did name some intellectual authors, and there was a lot of circumstantial evidence connecting some of them. But since then, you asked, the Guatemalan, this conviction, in a sense, the Guatemalan legal system became, was looked up, set an example for all Latin America, right? And it really was a decision that was made by numerous people and internationally in terms of the support they led. They realized that the only thing that was going to allow this Guatemala, which at one point was transshipping 80% of the cocaine that reached the United States, coming from South America, was going through Guatemala, just to give you some idea of the inducement to corruption in that society, right? And the impunity. They realized that the only way to preserve the rule of law, to give democracy a fighting chance in that country, was going to be strengthening the legal system. And Daniel, as you know well, they succeeded, right? It was like the shining light of legal systems, in Central America for many years. But it was very hard. Even said that doesn't mean you win every case. It doesn't mean intimidation goes away. It doesn't stop becoming incredibly dangerous. It's not as if though narco politicians and narco military men, turn their back and hide under the table just because, the US and Europe are pouring money into this very brave little justice system. It was still incredibly dangerous, And just they couldn't get the political will, the political circumstances, the right moment to really push forward on the case. It doesn't mean they stopped investigating. They know so much more now. I can say confidently, I've been shown incredible evidence myself, right? I have some of the documentation here in this office. They know the structure of that crime now. They know how it happened. But it would be so incredibly explosive, to move forward. And the time was coming. And maybe it'll come again. But as you know, the Trump administration, the Guatemalan legal system was about to indict President Morales, the last president, an incredibly corrupt president. And Trump himself has great sympathy for hostility to prosecutors on behalf of corrupt presidents. And the Trump administration 100% supported this president's attempt to essentially dismantle the Guatemalan justice system, secede and neuter it, right? And the constitutional court system. And so the Guatemalan court system now has been more or less crippled. Thanks to Trump. I think it's the most devastating US intervention in Guatemala since the '54 coup. It's nothing anyone pays attention to in the news. It's just Guatemala. There's so many other things to look at with this guy. But it'll be remembered. And hopefully, but the example is still there. The people who know how to do it are still there. The Arturo Aguilars are still there. No, the minor Melgars, and so forth, right? The Jorge Garcias, who has the case now. So hopefully things will change again, and that space will be reclaimed by people who have experience, who know, who are just driven to make this justice system, work, right? So that's what lies ahead.
Any plans to show this in Guatemala at some point?
We would love to. There's been talk of a screening, obviously with coronavirus, put a few things on hold with some of our planning, but I'm really keen for there to be a screening at some point, and we're working with people on the ground so that there could be a screening. So fingers crossed. And just, in closing thoughts, I hope that people see that this is not just a story that's relevant to Guatemala. Obviously, it's universal in terms of the importance of a strong judiciary in a democracy, and the importance of people that are willing to stand up and fight for it is relevant all over the world, and as we've seen. And so I hope by just shining some light on some of the heroes of this case, it inspires people. One of the things I missed the most from the film really is Leopoldo Zesig was one of the people that suffered the most threats throughout the entire course of the case, and we touch on it, but we never really had time to go into the full depth of what happened to Zesig. But they are like true heroes that showed some real courage in the face of a lot of danger when a lot of people wouldn't. And so I hope that people, one of the things that Frank says in the book, I think, is that they haven't, even after all these years, they didn't really get their full due or recognition for what they achieved in this really historical moment in Guatemala's history. And so I hope people start to recognize how incredible they are.
Yeah, well, I think the film captures that. I hope it gets shown in Guatemala. I do think what was accomplished with that case, even if the intellectual authors, the state, even if they haven't been brought to justice, even with all the reverses, today in Guatemala, the justice system is in bad shape. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of impunity. But there's a fundamental difference from, marking before the Harari case and after. Before was total impunity, absolute total. And in places like Guatemala and around the world, the difference between absolute impunity and just a little bit of justice is existential, is fundamental. Because it gives people reason to hope. and it gives people who want to tell the truth a reason to think if they do it, if they take these risks, justice is actually possible.
It's possible. It can be done.
And that's what that case showed. Now, but it's not over, because there's all the distortion and misinformation about the case, but also about the investigations and about the justice system. And there's where, in addition to the struggle in the courts by the lawyers, what's so important is the people who write about it, whether it's those journalists or the reporting Frank did in his book, and now your film. And that's why I hope it'll be shown in Guatemala, because this is an ongoing give and take and push, and it hasn't ended. So as I said at the outset, I really do think this is the extension of the work of the bishop. I think it's an important contribution, and I just want to congratulate you, and thank you both for joining in this discussion. And I hope everyone will enjoy the film and will now go read Frank's book.
If anyone's remotely interested in Frank's book, is a fantastically in-depth telling of what happened. So I really recommend it.
And when Paul does the 10-part series next, I hope everyone will watch that too. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you, everyone.